Sometimes it's good to have a break, and that's exactly what I need to do right now. It's October, and well, after going through a couple of army projects back to back, I thought it would be kind of fun to do something a little bit different just to break the monotony of army painting. It's October, and that means it's kind of Orctober, right? I'm going to paint some orcs. But which orcs? Well, we're going to find out after this. Hi everybody, welcome back, I'm Wayne. Thanks for joining me again. Right, so orcs. Let's talk about orcs. I'm not a massive fan. If you've watched my videos for a while, you'll see it's something that I've not really tackled. Not because I'm scared of painting them, they just don't really do anything for me, to be honest. However, I have a friend and he absolutely loves his orcs. And I've kind of had a little bit of an orcish itch. He passed me a couple of his models to paint. And I thought that'd be really fun, and that's what I'm going to try and do. He's into iron jaws. Those aren't my favourite orcs, not that I do have any real favourites. I much prefer, I don't know, I don't like how they look. They kind of look like, well, Space Marines in Age of Sigmar mashed up with Imperial fists. I just don't like them. I do not like the iron jaws. But he's giving me a shaman, and I think it's a Warhammer Plus orc war boss from a couple of years ago, and he's asked me to paint them to fit in with his army, and that's exactly what I'm going to try and do. I've got to fit in with his colour scheme, so I can't go too far off piste, but I want to do it in a manner that if he wants to copy it, he can. If he wants to add something else, I'm not too bothered about the war boss, but the shaman, I think that's going to be kind of fun to paint. Let's tackle it and see what I come up with.
Let's take a look at these models then. The first one is this orc mega boss, and I don't hate the model, I'm just not a massive fan of it. This guy, however, this shaman, much more of a fan of it. I think it's really interesting, looks terrifying, and this is definitely something I can work with. I've got to say I'm quite excited about this one. Right, what are we going to do then to start off with? Well, you'll notice that I've done something a little bit different. I've gone with the black prime, and then I've gone with the grey prime, and I'm going to come in now with a white spot prime just on the elements that I want to pick out. So obviously this is going to have some OSL as well coming from the top of the staff. So let's make sure we hit that as we would, making sure that the white points are going to be the hottest, brightest points on the model. And that's exactly what I'm going to try and do now, thinking that this is going to be casting some OSL as well on the model later on. So I'm always going to be working through the painting process with that in mind, using that foundational understanding to make some informed decisions about what I'm going to do, where I'm laying the paint as we go through it, but we'll pick that up a little bit later on. Let's in the first instance just get the white down, and as always I'm going to be using some Liquitex white ink here through the airbrush. You might be wondering why I've gone with the grey all over prime as well, which is not something I would normally do. I've gone with the black as the undercoat, and then, as I say, a grey all over the model. The reason I've done it in this way on these particular models is I want them to fit in with my friend's army, and this is more akin to how he tends to paint stuff. He doesn't just go over black like I do, which is absolutely fine. This is also really going to help as well with some of the colours that we're going to be using inside of this. So the iron jaws do have some yellow on there, especially on that war boss, mega boss, whatever it's called. And going over grey rather than straight from black, even with a white ink over the top of it, is going to help us get a nicer effect, because we want that yellow not just to stand out, but I want to have a bit of a gradient in there as well. So working up from that black over grey and then to the white is going to help us sell that effect. It's not going to do all of the work for us, but we are going to get a good kickstart with it. So you'll notice as well that I'm spending a little bit more time than you might expect with the white ink, establishing the volumes and the highlights where I'm going to place them on the model in this instance is something that is a little bit more deliberate than how I would normally paint if I was doing this on an entire army. Now I've got the luxury of not painting an entire army of these, so I am painting them more as characters. I want them to stand out for him. I want them to look really good in his wider force. So I'm paying more attention to where I'm laying the light whites down. Again, thinking to the right of what I'm going to be doing later on. And it's all this preparatory work that really helps you achieve a decent finish. without putting too much effort in. It's not like we're going to be painting these for display quality, but it's certainly going to give us a really nice tabletop standard. And it's one that's replicable as well. That's something that I've also been conscious of. He's not as into painting as I am, so I wanted to do something that was easy enough should he want to go down this route, but not something that was so massively time consuming that it was not something that was going to be possible. I'm going to jump backwards and forwards between these two models as we're working on them rather than going through each thing step by step. It'll just make it a little bit easier and hopefully a little bit more of a fun style of video. So the next thing I'm going to do is pick out that white ink again, just using what was left in my airbrush. I'm going to start to lay down a couple of underpainted highlights on both of the models. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the Megaboss for this one, just starting to think where I might put some scratches on the metals, where I want the highlights to live. Let's talk about the skin then. I'm going to grab a purple ink. Purple? Yep, purple to paint green orc skin. Why am I going to do that? Well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to thin this down with a little bit of water. The purple ink is very highly pigmented and I don't want it to be too dark, so adding a good old slosh of water in there is going to really bring that saturation down, and we're going to use this basically all over the skin. You don't have to do this. I just like to work my greens up from a purple base, especially on green skin. It gives a warmer undertone and a finish that I'm much happier with. It is of course going to make it a little bit of a longer process to get up to the green, but you could completely avoid this step if you wanted. This is something how I've always done the green skin. Occasionally, if it's an orc with a darker green skin, I might even go darker with the purple and then come back in with the airbrush and start to work up some transparent layers of yellow before I then washed it all with green after the fact. If you think saturation's too high, then do water it down a little bit more. You can always come in and add more later into the shadows, but you don't want it to be too saturated on the higher points that we were losing what we did with that white highlight in the previous step. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to leave the skin for the time being and start to concentrate on other areas, basically laying down all of the base colours. Okay, let's step it up a little bit now. I'm going to grab Skeleton Horde and some Contrast Wildwood. Skeleton Horde is one of the best contrast colours that I know of. I use it for so many things, and Contrast Wildwood is just the same. It's a great warm tone. Now I'm going to pick out all of the bone colours in Skeleton Horde, anything that I want to kind of have a gold hue as well, so the Stormcast helmets on the belt and in the hand, anything like that, any bone details, the teeth, absolutely anything. Now, why am I using a bone colour for the base for a metallic? Well, if you use something that's similar in tone, you will get a much richer version of that colour. So doing gold directly over black, you won't get the same luster as you will if you do it over something like a brown or something like this Skeleton Horde. The Contrast Wildwood I'm going to use to pick out any of the wraps, any of the leather details, anything like that that I want to read as a material. We can come back in and we can start to change the colour up later on, but again, just for this step to base everything so we've got a real feeling of what the model's going to look like when we're finished off, it's perfect, especially with the shaman as well, because we've got much more material on that guy rather than the armour. I always find using a very moist brush as well, it really helps with this paint. I'm going to do it as thin as I can really, and I'm going to put multiple layers on. As I keep saying, it's much easier to add paint than it is to remove it, and I want to work a thinner covering of the paint into the deeper folds. Yes, I know it's contrast, we could put one thick coat on, but that's not going to work for me on how I want. The reason I use contrast paint so much is I like the consistency of them, I like the transparency, and that works in our favour when we want to do something like this. We really want to benefit from that underpainting we've done earlier on. So putting the paint on it as I have here and then going back into the water and then using the water to actually thin it out even more on the model and to help me get the dark parts that I want in some places and the lighter parts, I can use the water to almost break the pigment apart, and it gives you something of a texture. So if you look closely at this, rather than painting a micro texture to look like the grain of leather, as the paint starts to break apart, you start to get that sort of texture, and it just adds another layer of detail that if you look and you notice and you know it's there, then you appreciate it, and if you don't, it's fine still. It looks great. I'm going to grab some Xandri dust and I'm going to work a little bit more on the leather now. I need to bring up some of the highlights a little bit more. I did paint the blue trousers on the Mega Boss as well, just using a little bit of blue ink. But for this, I want to add a little bit more texture, so I'm just going to stipple some of the Xandri dust on there as well. I'm going to go fairly loose where I want it to be. I'm not being overly bothered about how much of this I'm putting on now, because bear in mind that OSL coming from the flame, smoke, whatever this substance is above him is going to basically saturate this in a green teal like glow later on. So I'm using this as a foundation to bring that up. Why am I using the leather color of it then? Well, I personally like to paint things so that they are pretty much the color of whatever it is that it needs to be, even if I'm going to cover it up. That way, in my head at least, I get more of a natural like effect of how that light would interplay with that material, that color, rather than just coming in with a white. I probably will come in with a lighter color later on, just so that I get the very highlights of it and it looks a little bit more cinematic almost, I suppose, to use that term. Onto that green skin then, I'm going to use probably a green shade, maybe 2 thin coats of this, perhaps 3 in the deeper recesses. Now, again, as I've said, it's much easier to add this than take it away. I'm using a moist brush, as I always do, and that's going to avoid getting any tea staining. Definitely not something I want. Let's use the light that we established in the first step with that white ink to figure out where we want to place this. Now, I want to get coverage over all of the purple areas, but I'm not going to worry too much about in the shadows. That's where I want this purple. Trust the process. It does look really good. Now, I want to make sure in the shadows at the back of his head, I am actually getting some coverage of the green on there, because I do want that to read as darker green being on top. But on the face, I'm being very, very careful, and between the fingers as well, I want that to remain purple and read as purple in the shadows. But I'm going to add a couple of layers on the face so that it definitely reads as green. I'll be coming back in with some highlights later on anyway, but it's smoothness I'm looking for at this stage. Let's tackle those highlights then. I'm going to use Death Guard green, but you can use any kind of green here and just mix a little bit of flesh color in with it, something like an off-white or any kind of flesh tone will do, just to bring up the lightness a little bit. And I'm going to start applying that standard layer paint, just as you normally would, to any of the high parts on the model that you want to read as brighter. I'm also going to use this on the bone elements that we created earlier, just to pick it out. I'll probably add a little bit more of that flesh tone in if you do need to, just to take a little bit more of that green out. But you can start doing it progressively lighter and lighter and lighter at this point if you want to, or you can come back in later once you've got all of the other colours on the model, and then you can start to see where you want to bring out those highlights on the face just to draw people's attention into it. You could even start to look at bringing some of this colour into the cloth if you wanted to. So with the shaman, as you can see here, I'm just starting to pick out some of the highest folds on that cloth. I'm not painting it as such, I'm just letting the tip of the brush kind of dance across those folds just to give it a little bit more texture. Starting to pick up the pace a little bit. Let's get some of the other details painted. I'm going to use some thinned down black contrast paint here. Black Templar it is that I'm using, but any thinned down black paint will do. I'm going to start to paint in any of the rope details that I'd not already painted a bit of a darker brown. And I'm also going to come in and start to base coat any of the weapons. Anything that I want to read as metallic after the fact, so I can get some metallic paint on this, I will paint black at this point. I could also go in and start to add a little bit of black to the tips of the horns and such. Any of the bone elements that I want to read as decayed, older, weathered and withered, I will do that either now or later on. It doesn't really matter which you do it. Sometimes I prefer to do it further in the process just so I can get an idea of where I want the bright points to be on the model, and then I can use that to either put the black at the start of the horn or the end of the horn, taking a little bit of creative liberty there just to frame the face perhaps. This yellow armor then, I'm going to use Imperial Fist Citadel contrast paint, or you could use some yellow ink. What I'm going to do at this point is just make sure I get it on all of the armor. Again, I'll be using a moist brush. I don't want this to go on too heavily. It is a very heavily pigmented paint is this, and it does give you a very rich, vibrant yellow color. Don't worry, I'll be dulling this down with a couple of additional steps. All I'm worried about here is making sure I get all of the armor painted without going too thick. It needs to be bright on the higher points, but you're going to get that from that zenithal we did earlier. That nice gradation from the white to the grey with the black undercoat will give us some really interesting textures, really interesting shadows on the model. You could just leave it with this yellow if you wanted a much brighter finish. That's exactly not what I'm going to do though. I'm going to come back in with some other colours. So get this applied to everything that you want to be this armour colour. Once all that's dry, I'm going to come back in with another Citadel contrast colour, Iandan yellow, and I'm going to start basically putting that on in exactly the same way, but I'm going to keep it to the lower half of the panels. Using my brush, again, I would have used an airbrush for this usually if I was painting more than one, but for this, I'm going to stick with the brush. And bearing in mind, I want to start where I want the paint to be lighter and then lift the brush off where I want it to be darker. That's where most of the ink will be deposited. So you'll notice here, I'm working down the panels. Now, this isn't going to look like it's doing much at this point, but I'll be doing several layers of it. Each time I'll be using less and less of the armor panel. So I'll start off using about 50% of the armor panel painting it. Then I'll go down to maybe 40, 30%, all the way down to wherever I want the darkest point to be. You could manually paint some of this as well in the deeper recesses if you want that to read darker. It's entirely up to you, rule of cool. I'm winging it somewhat, just going with what looks good, using that underpainting we did previously to see where the natural shadows lay on the model and figuring it out as I go. But for most part, using the technique that I've given you on each of the armor panels, working from about halfway down, will see you right on this one. It takes a little bit of time, but by the time you've got to the end of the model, go in with another layer pretty much straight away. And I think you'll agree, it starts to get pretty nice, pretty dark, pretty deep, but rich fairly fast. I think I spent around 15 minutes on this entire process, so it didn't take too long. And I think you'll agree, the effort put in was worth it. It started to look much more vibrant and way more interesting than just keeping that one layer of yellow on it. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. I still would have liked to have done it with the airbrush. I would have got a much nicer finish, but we've still got another few steps to go yet. It's not quite as dark as I wanted it to read. I think I could have left it here if I had wanted to, but I wanted to take it just another step further and bring the darkest points of that armor, the recesses and the very edges of it just a little bit darker before I moved on. To get that darkness, I'm going to use another contrast paint, Snakebite Leather, a very wet brush. I'm going to basically repeat what I did in the previous step, working on the very edges of the armor panel. Sometimes I'm going to put a splodge of the color on and then just blend it in, feather it in using that moist brush. You can even use a second brush if you want. A two brush technique can often help, one to wick away and the other one to start to blend in. I'm going to as well go into the armor panels just to those deepest recesses, make it a little bit darker and just help those armor panels stand out a little bit. This is one of those steps that you really don't need to do. For me though, this is what sold the armor and made me feel a little bit happier with it. It brought some texture to it. It made it look much less stark and it started to read more as orcish in my opinion. Back to the conversation we had earlier about how the head would stand out. Now you can start to see where we might need to place some additional highlights as well. But before we do that, let's tackle the metals, and that's really going to help as well. To keep it nice and simple for the metals, I'm going to use a gunmetal that's going to give us as deep base colours and a brighter steel colour for any highlights, scratches, anything like that, just keeping it to these two. Now I'm going to come in with a dry brush and just get that darker metallic gunmetal on everything in the first instance, being as careful as I can not to get it on any of the other elements that I don't want it on. If I get any on the armor, that's not a problem because I am going to attack the armor later with this darker gunmetal as well, so that we can get some chipped edges to it so that it doesn't look just like it's completely yellow metal. So it looks a little bit weather beaten and, you know, like it was painted. I'm not going to do that too heavily. I don't know how my friend wants his army to look, but if it was me, I would be going in with it pretty darn heavily. But anyway, we won't get into that at the moment. Just work your way around the model, get this metallic base color on everywhere that I got black earlier. Bearing in mind, you should always keep your brush fairly moist when you're doing dry brushing. Not wet by any means, but make sure it's not completely dry. I know it's counter to what you would expect with the technique being called dry brushing, but we've talked about this in numerous videos. Let's bust out a bit of that brighter steel color on this palette then and start applying that. I'm just going to go with concentrating on the edges of the weapons and applying some scratches. Use a fine brush for this. Just be careful what you're doing. You can use the edge of your brush obviously to almost dry brush it as if you were hedge highlighting, Whatever technique works for you. I prefer to paint it on by hand, and then you can come back in with a dry brush and just hit the edge of the blade. It's a dead easy, straightforward way to get a nice shining edge, a working edge on whatever blade or surface it is that you want to read as a little bit more worn, as if it's getting more use, as you would expect a cutting edge to be. Let's get some of those other elements darkened down then using some Nuln Oil or other black wash, or even thinned down black paint, as I said earlier. And I'm literally going to just repeat the same step as I did. So some thinned down paint, Nuln Oil, and I'm going to apply that to either the tips or the bases of the horns and bone elements, depending on what is your personal preference. In this case, I'm going to do it towards the bases because I want the brightest point in the center of the model to be the orc's face by making the surrounding area darker. In this case, the base of these horns on his chest, these fangs, is going to make the brighter points, its face, stand out more without actually making it any brighter. So the overall contrast of the model doesn't change. It's just changing and manipulating the area around the face is going to make it stand out more prominently. This is what I mean by coming backwards and forwards as you're working on a model with the end goal in mind of what it is you want to achieve. You can then manipulate your color scheme quite subtly to do that without increasing the overall brightness of the model. And of course, we are working on two models at the same time here. We're working on the shaman as well. And I don't want to forget this guy. I'm basically doing exactly the same thing as I've just done, but you'll notice I'm actually doing it the other way around on this guy. So I'm making the ends of the tusks that he's wearing on his head darker because I want his face to stand out. Why am I doing that? Well, we're going to have some OSL from his staff that's emitting this light source on his face. So I do want to make the areas around his face a little bit brighter so that we've got something to highlight against and make that really stand out. And we are almost at the end of this now, so we're going to use another couple of colours. I'm going to pick out some Rakarth Flesh, a very light green, white, and I'm going to use another contrast paint, Sigvold Burgundy, to pick out things like the tongue and any of the fleshy parts. That's fairly easy to do. I'm just going to use thin down paint. I won't talk you through that process. I'm going to dot the eyes with white, again using a nice fine brush. Just take your time on getting those dotted. And then the green and the white I'm going to use to start to highlight the skin. I'll do this on both of the orcs, less so on the war boss, but more on this guy, because I want to take the highlights a little bit further than I normally would, because we're going to have that OSL cast on his face. So having it brighter means that the OSL will cast a nicer, warmer, brighter light on his face, making the darker recesses of his face, the eye sockets, stand out more, because it's that contrast between light and dark that actually sells the glowing effect. Speaking of the glowing effect, since we're done with the war boss for this point, let's get some more work done on the shaman. So I'm going to use that white paint and I'm going to very lightly start to dry brush over the very top part, the shoulder and the head of the shaman. In fact, this is acting as a reprime of the miniature overall. So when we put the paint on top of it, it'll be much brighter. So that OSL will really start to pop against the contrasted deep shadows we've already established with the purple skin tone and all of the other bits and pieces. We're only going to do the very top part of the shaman with this. And again, I'm going to do it very lightly. It's much easier to add more if you want, rather than take it away. Glows an OSL. So let me tell you how I do it. I start with white, and then I'm going to go to this teal blue as the base color, and then to a yellow, back to white, and then to a bright green, then back to white, a little bit more yellow to blend them together, then the darker green on the coldest part, back to white, back to the light green, back to the yellow, back to white again, and some dark green right at the end to make it really start to pop. You don't have to do this many steps, but this is how you get a really vibrant green glow. These colours are absolutely fantastic. They're very cheap inks. They're Daler Round FW range. I've been using them for years. They're so cheap comparatively. I've already prepared the area with white, so the first thing I'm going to do is come in with this teal. Why am I using blue to paint green, I hear you ask? Well, this is what really makes it pop. It gives you that transition. It smooths everything out. And I'm going to start applying this to the areas where I want the darkest green to be, the points that are going to be furthest away from the light source. So thinking about the top of the shaman's shoulders, his face, the darker part of the smoke that we've purposefully left black on there because we want to go from the lightest, brightest point, which is going to be the part that's emanating the light, to the darker point. This is what's going to give you the effect of it glowing. It's not the actual colour that it glows that gives you that effect. It's the area around it that casts the light, because the part that's glowing will be naturally overexposed. The glow comes from the dissipation of the light. If you do want me to do a full explainer video of this, let me know down in the comments. It's one of those things that I've been meaning to do for a while and I've just not got around to. Anyway, right, let's crack on with the next step. I'm going to jump straight to green now. I was going to go with yellow first, but at this point I want to get a little bit of the green on just to see how it reads. So I'm going onto the face, around the head, and I'll start to work my way onto the light source as well. Between this, I will be going backwards and forwards, as I said earlier, with the white, and that's just going to reinforce the brightest parts. Why is it going to be important to do that? Well, because you want to get the highest, brightest point to be, well, as bright as possible, and you do that by going back to white, so that any colour you put over white will actually naturally be brighter than any of the colours around it, because, well, you can't really get brighter than white, can you? Doing that starts to sell the effect, and it is that extra step of going backwards and forwards that really does start to pay dividends. You can see already it's starting to look really good, and we've only put 2 colours on so far. It really does all come back to going back in with the white paint and then flip-flopping backwards and forwards with the different colours as you're working on the different coloured paints. I did unfortunately lose the rest of the footage of me using the yellow and the darker green. So as I say, if you do want to see a dedicated video just to doing a green glow specifically, let me know down in the comments and I will absolutely put that together for you. It is on the list, but I will move it a little bit forwards if that's something that you guys are really interested in. With this final bit done, the highlights finished, let's have a look at what we ended up with, and hopefully my friend will be a happy chappy. Let me know what you think. Let's take a look.
What did you think? Shall I tell you what I think? I do not like it. The shaman, I'm really happy with. I think that looks cool. I'm pretty happy with that. It's not how I would want to paint it personally, but it's not for my army. The orc boss in, I don't know what it's called, the yellow armored dude, I hate it. I absolutely hate it. I wouldn't be offended if he strips the model. That might be something that he wants to do. I don't know. I didn't enjoy anything about painting that model. If you've painted it, let me know what you think. Am I being overly critical? Is it just because I don't like orcs? I don't know. I didn't like the sculpt. I just hate how the armor's turned out. It's not for me at all, but it was something different. It's freshened my palette. It's kind of given me some excitement back to the painting process. It's made me want to experiment with other things going forward, and that's exactly what I wanted to achieve. Hopefully, it's got him some more models that he can get on the tabletop and enjoy his hobby and his gaming. That's exactly what I wanted to get out with it. With that said, I suppose it was a success. What do you think though? Let me know down in the comments. I'm excited to paint some other different stuff, and I'm definitely going to be doing that in future episodes. Possibly less army painting, but we'll see. We've still got a couple of armies to finish off, and we've definitely got some aspects of the soul blight to get finished. We've got the slaves to carry on with, another couple of little projects that will definitely span multiple videos. Thanks for joining me in this one. I do appreciate it. Have a good Orctober, and I'll see you next time. See ya.